what I'd like to try to do is tell you just a little bit about Franklin Roosevelt's campaign in 1932 and then his first 100 days, and then try to apply it incongruently to Barack Obama, who gives me some free advertising in his stump speech by talking about this being a new defining moment for America. The reason that I called my book The Defining Moment was that in the 1932-33 period, the United States redrew its social contract between the people and the government. They did so in an era of crisis that was more severe and therefore more helpful in bringing about major change, but there continue to be a lot of lessons. I think the first thing, though, that folks have to understand is that the New Deal was not a blueprint. It's not like the Brain Trust got together in 1932 and they came up with a series of very clear policy proposals like Barack Obama has today, and then they went and they implemented them, one by one. The head of the Brain Trust, a guy named Raymond Moley, compared the idea of the New Deal somehow having been this carefully articulated plan to the idea that a messy boy's bedroom full of broken baseball bats and old science experiments and old clothes had all been put there by an interior decorator. And what he meant was that the New Deal was very seat of the pants. And in his inaugural address, his acceptance speech in 1932, when he first mentioned the idea of a New Deal, it was ripped off from a cover story in the New Republic of a couple of weeks earlier, where the author had been arguing that all technological progress should be stopped because it costs jobs. That was when they were starting to worry about, mechanization, automation, taking away jobs. So that was that guy's idea of a New Deal. It wasn't FDR's idea. He just kind of grabbed the line, or a speechwriter did. And FDR himself didn't have a fully articulated sense of where he was going at all. For instance, during the campaign, he had one free trade speech, one protectionist speech, and he told Moley, just weave them together, And on prohibition, he wasn't a wet, he wasn't a dry, he was a damp, leave it up to the states. Eleanor got very angry at him for retreating from his support for the League of Nations. And so in a lot of ways, he was a candidate that a lot of progressives probably wouldn't, necessarily like if you were voting in 1932. And he kind of came in on a anti-Hoover, anti-status quo platform, which I think has a lot of similarities to Obama. If he is elected, it's not going to be because people are necessarily voting for the particulars of his program, but because they've had it with the status quo. That does give you an opportunity, especially if you come in with enough support in the Congress, but it will by necessity be a improvisational, seat-of-the-pants kind of operation in the same way that it was for Franklin Roosevelt. That's the nature of politics, and so what you're looking for is the temperament in a president and the flexibility and the inventiveness to come up with, sometimes accidental, as in the case of a good chunk of the early New Deal, but nonetheless effective policy. Now, it also requires the ability to multitask, and this is something that I've discussed with Senator Obama a little bit, because we did have a conversation at one point about the idea of the 100 days, or in his case, the first year, for argument's sake. And Roosevelt got 15 major pieces of legislation through Congress in his first 100 days. They weren't all rubber stamped. In fact, only 2 or 3 of them went through without debate. There was intense debate the whole time. So I think it's a bit of a myth that somehow, because he had a big Democratic Congress, he therefore could get everything he wanted. There were a lot of Southern Democratic conservatives who were very much against a lot of what he wanted to do. So he had to use those temperamental qualities you know, what Oliver Wendell Holmes described him in that period, second-class intellect, first-class temperament. Now, we don't know yet what kind of president Barack Obama would be, but we do know that he has a first-class intellect and, from most accounts, all accounts really, a first-class temperament. He's unflappable, he's not inflexible, he reaches out, he listens to different kinds of advice. And so there, in terms of the personality traits that he would bring, he compares favorably. In terms of the political structure of the country right now, it's going to be harder for him to get big things done with entrenched interests wielding the kind of power that they do now. They did then as well. There were very powerful lobbies in the 1930s. Sometimes what FDR would do is not worry too much about the particulars. So on the Farm Bill, where they set up the system of price supports for the first time, Agricultural Adjustment Act, he said to the farmers and the processors and the consumer groups and all the various elements in farm legislation, which in the farm economy, which at that time accounted for 50% of the American economy, he said, just go in a room, you shut the door, you argue it out, you come up with some kind of compromise. Whatever you come up with, I'm going to sign because we need legislation and we have to have it immediately. So there's a bias for action that is the first requirement of success. And as long as you're giving the country an overall sense of direction, so in the case of Obama, it would be an overall emphasis on the squeezed middle class, then the voters, the public will come along if they get the general idea. And I think that's where Obama has to score on Thursday night and for the duration of this campaign. He has to give people an overall sense, not just of inspiration, but of where he's going to take the American economy and how he's going to redraw that social contract that Franklin Roosevelt did. In his case, in Roosevelt's case, the stakes were very high. I argue in my book that he rescued both capitalism and democracy. A lot of people wanted a dictator at that time. He was tempted. New York Daily News ran a big headline, "Wanted a Dictator." Studebaker had a car, The Dictator, sold very well. Walter Lippmann, the columnist, in the days when columnists had power, went to him a couple days before the inauguration and said, "Franklin, you may have to assume dictatorial powers." So Roosevelt is not, Obama would not have that kind of leeway to in terms of moving aggressively. But I do think that there is a sense that the complexity and the severity of the problems are such, and the patience with inaction has extended significantly enough that he could have a very fruitful first year in office if he plays his cards right. I think the one other thing to keep in mind is the non-legislative part of the job, the communications portion of the job. The way Roosevelt really rescued the banking system was with his first fireside chat. The same people who had been lining up in these terrifying bank runs that had shut basically the economy of the United States had gone into meltdown. After Roosevelt got off the radio and urged them to take their money from out of their mattresses and redeposit it, they lined up to put their money back in. Now that's leadership, and that communicative part of this is so important. If you can't really communicate, you can't lead. And that is, again, something, and this will change. He'll have his ups and downs. He's having a little bit of a down right now, but generally speaking, Obama has a tremendous capacity to communicate. And that is enormously important, not just in moving legislation and lighting fire under the Congress, but in changing the conversation. If you're going to redraw that social contract, you have to change the conversation with the bully pulpit, elevate the debate, as Obama did in his race speech, do that on several other issues. So you change the climate to one where you can have more success. So do we have any time for questions? Or Okay, well, that's obviously made a big impact.
Matt Morningstar from the New York delegation. I was wondering how you reconcile your suggestion that Obama should continue to speak about themes in reference to FDR's success in '32 with Clinton's success in the back half of the primary, who was speaking to the more, it seemed, specific or practical concerns of voters, especially through the Midwest, and how he, and A, is that a reality? Does that need to be addressed? And B, if it does, how does that become part of the conversation that Obama's having, or how did FDR do that to the extent he did?
Well, you do have to be specific, and he has it, and I think he understands that this is going to be what he describes as a nuts and bolts speech on Thursday night, and that's been something that's been lacking for Obama. Is he hasn't had what in the column I have in this week's Newsweek I refer to as sticky themes and sticky specifics on solving people's problems. So, you know, this morning I was asking various governors and Obama people who were coming by the Newsweek space, you know, what is the takeaway for the middle class going to be on Thursday night? And they don't have those frames. That's why I started by talking about the New Deal. You know, people weren't quite sure what the New Deal was, but they knew that it was something good. And the rest of it you can kind of fill in, but you have to create that frame that goes beyond hope and change to something more specific and practical. And they understand that, and the big question for Thursday night is how do they start to execute that better? It's something that is halfway in between the kind of policy speech that he's been giving a lot of that is not really of great interest to most people because it's too specific, and something that is, you know, at 30,000 feet inspirationally and doesn't address people's practical concerns. So you've got to find that sweet spot in between. And I agree with you that I think Hillary did do some of that toward the end of the campaign and connecting on lunch bucket, kitchen table issues, and Obama needs to do a lot more of that.
Okay, the gentleman in the back, please.
You made a distinction between the two, that Roosevelt was more concerned about performance than loyalty, and the Congress.
Yes, in my book, that's a big theme. I'm glad I didn't even talk about it today, so you picked up on that.
I just wanted to remind you.
That's great.
I was wondering if you might comment about this issue. For instance, the people who came back from Iraq, Wolfowitz and Bremer, who were acknowledged with medals and so forth. Does this reflect, in your mind, his unawareness, or is this just strictly loyalty?
Bush, well, I think President Bush is what I call a toxic combination of arrogance and incompetence. And that you can be arrogant if you're really competent, and you can get if you're incompetent and you're modest and winning about it, you can kind of get away with that. But if you're arrogant and incompetent combined, you got a real problem. And I think that you know that. I mean, I don't have time for it today, but I got a whole long rap on how Roosevelt and Bush resembled each other tremendously before they came to the presidency. You know, Groton, Harvard, Andover, Yale. Both were called lightweights before they got there, but one of the reasons they performed so differently in office is that Roosevelt did put performance, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time put performance above loyalty, and Bush put loyalty above performance, and Roosevelt was supple and flexible and open-minded, and Bush was rigid and closed-minded. And those kinds of personal qualities are very important, and I think they're very important in this election because John McCain, who I have admired in some respects over the years, I think temperamentally his impetuous quality, his shoot from the hip, think later on policy issues, his sometimes vindictive quality. These are things that need to get better explored. And in terms of his loyalty to people, I think that ties into his sense of honor, which can also be a problem if taken to too great an extent. So I'm hoping that there's more discussion of these personal qualities. I guess we're we're done.
Okay, I think we have, I think that's the,
Yeah.
Any more questions? One last question. You, sir.
This premise that there's a crisis in the country now that's like the Great Depression in the 1930s.
It's not as nearly as severe, so we're not quite there yet in terms of the comparison.
And I guess if the financial markets continue to melt down and so on, we could have something that would look more like that. But I guess the question is, even assuming that we go further in that direction, is Washington changed so structurally now that the ability of the special interests and the lobbies to impede legislation makes it virtually impossible to transform things?
No, it doesn't make it virtually impossible. It definitely does not make it virtually impossible. Lobbyists have been powerful since Daniel Webster was on the payroll of a Massachusetts bank at the same time he was serving in the Senate. So the special interests have always been powerful. I think with the internet, there's more of an ability to build a countervailing force. I believe, though, that first thing that has to happen in the web community is that the cult of anonymity has to end. Because if you talk to a member of Congress, if he gets 50,000 emails and they're anonymous, he doesn't care. He gets 200,000, he doesn't care. If he gets 500 with names and addresses of people in his district, you have his attention right away and will for the foreseeable future on a particular issue. So there are lots of new ways to try to break the stranglehold of special interests. Obama's 2 million donors is a hugely important part of that. He basically doesn't know the rich folks anything. I mean, yeah, it's nice he goes to fundraisers, they're helping support his campaign, but there's a big difference between accounting for 40% or whatever and accounting for 75% of somebody's coffers. So I think there are a lot of ways to move legislation. It takes a willingness to compromise on the part of the progressive community that a lot of New Dealers had a hard time with. They didn't like what Roosevelt did on Social Security in 1935. They didn't think he went nearly far enough. They were very upset about it. And on a variety of other pieces of legislation, on banking, they wanted him to nationalize the banks. He wouldn't do that. So Obama will, if he's elected, would disappoint everybody in this room on at least one or two issues. But if he wasn't, it would mean he wasn't navigating in a skillful enough way to really get big things done.